I'm Andrea Hill, owner of Hill Management Group and the Works brands, and today we're going to talk about the principles of graphic design. As more and more business owners create their own advertising using tools like Visme and Canva, it's become clear that most people do not understand the components of a good advertising layout. Though the internet and digital advertising are relatively new, and rules have been adapted to accommodate the new media, the principles of good design remain consistent, and they've been studied and refined for a long time. Color theory, the use of shapes, eye path, which is also referred to as movement, and composition are all elements you must understand to make your ads effective. There is a huge difference between putting information on a page and creating information that is visually appealing and effective. Let's start by defining design. When we design something, we are creating it for a particular purpose or effect. If you design kitchen utensils, you're concerned about form. How does it look? How will it look in a certain type of decor? Is it recognizable as a utensil? You're also concerned about function. How does it work? How well does it do the task for which it was intended? When you design a room, both form, how does it look? How do you move through it? And function, does it serve the purpose for which it was intended? For instance, a kitchen versus a game room. Both form and function matter when you're designing rooms. And when you design jewelry, you are expressing those same ideas, form and function, in a wearable medium. The idea of designing for a purpose, of requiring that you meet both form and function, is the main thing that separates design from art. Art can disregard function. It can turn function into a farce. It can be entirely without function. Art is all about form, but design must include function. The main purpose of graphic design is communication. The essence of good graphic design is that it uses both form and function to bring someone to understanding something they didn't understand before, or to be interested in something in which they were not interested before. The fundamental purpose of graphic design is to make something easy to use or easy to understand. We can do that with words, but when we take those words and make them into visual images or shapes, they can be so much more powerful and much more accessible. Now, some graphical elements are obvious without previous exposure. For instance, the hand washing sign and the wheelchair access sign are clear without any further explanation. Other signs, like the buoy sign in this graphic, need some interpreting, some imprinting. You need to be exposed to them. So if you've spent much time around water, you've probably seen it and you know what it is. In fact, one of the earliest forms of modern graphic design was signs, and signs are a form of universal language. Most of the discipline of graphic design is wrapped up in the elements of visual hierarchy, because visual hierarchy plays a primary role in planning the structure of any ad or environment like websites that you create. Good visual hierarchies guide the viewers through the information you want them to see in the order that you want them to see it. Good visual hierarchies ensure that if a viewer only retains a small percent of the ad, the part they remember is the part that is most important to you as the advertiser. The best article and related infographic I have ever seen on the principles of visual hierarchy was done on the design software Visme's blog and written by a graphic designer named Samantha Lyle. I share some of their content here, but you really need to read the full article and save the infographic for yourself. The link to the article and infographic are right here on your slide. Also, Visme did not give me anything to produce this presentation, but we do use Visme as our chosen internal non-graphic designer tool. We use things like all the Adobe suite of tools as well for all of our graphic designers, but sometimes you need to put something together quickly, or a copywriter or a non-trained graphic designer needs to put together a graphical element, and Visme is the tool that we use for that. So anytime in this presentation that you see these graphics with that alternating, blue theme in them, these are taken from that Visme infographic. The first rule in visual hierarchy for graphic design is that size, and more importantly, relative size, is the fastest and most effective way to emphasize visual elements. Sizes determine the order that the human eye follows in an ad. So it helps the viewer to recognize some things faster than others and to identify which things are more important than others and also to retain some information better than others. Here are two more excellent examples of how to use size in creating visual hierarchy. On the left, you see an advertisement for Bentley. Now, if this had been a consumer ad for cars, there is no way the car would have been so tiny and the word next so large. But the intended target for this ad was people interested in the research and development and production capabilities of Bentley. So the ad was perfectly structured to put the attention on the right element. The idea that innovation and forward thinking are behind Bentley automotive products. In the second example, the use of size perspective helped drive the message home that no trash, even small biodegradable items, is small trash. It says in that lower corner, no hay basura pequeña. There's no such thing as small trash. The lime image is also a great example of the use of perspective, which is our next visual hierarchy example. Here's another one of those great Visme illustrations of these concepts. The use of perspective creates an illusion of depth. Just as a visual element, that's interesting. It makes it more interesting to look at. But depth is more important than simply creating visual interest. We can also use the sense of depth in an ad to make ads more relatable to the viewer. Depth can change the feeling of an ad by making it more dimensional. And images that are more dimensional are more visually interesting and more memorable, and we want ads to be both of those things. Also, as in the lime ad in the previous slide, perspective can take something that would have been an afterthought in a more typical image and turn it into the main point. This is a brilliant example of perspective, also taken from that Visme blog post. Most shoe ads focus on images of the shoes, usually from the top, right, or from the side, or of people running in shoes. Pirelli shoes use the perspective concept to make the walking the focus of the ad. The ad instantly makes you wonder how the shoes feel as they hit the ground. It makes you wonder what type of ground the shoes are hitting. It does more to put you in the Pirelli shoes than any shoe commercial I've ever seen. Perspective can make you feel the product, and that's why it's so important in visual hierarchy. Next, let's talk about color and contrast. It doesn't take much explanation to understand that using contrast and color make focal content pop out. But we use color and contrast for more than providing direction and readability, though direction and readability are very important. The use of high contrast also aids in the retention of information, and retention is a precious commodity in a world where the average person sees 5,000 ads per day. We're all aware that colors have psychological import, though it is important to be cautious about your color interpretations because they're not uniform across all cultures. The interpretations shown here represent the primary Western interpretations, but as you can see by looking at each of these colors, each color is capable of or likely to convey certain ideas and feelings. You can use the colors by themselves, or you can use them together, which is not the same as blending them. For instance, if you put yellow and blue on the same page, it's very likely to impart a feeling of happiness, but a sort of serene happiness. If you put brown and green on the same page, it's going to convey sort of a sense of solidness or dependability or trustworthiness. So you can put multiple colors into one graphic to convey sort of a combined feeling, or then you can blend colors as well to create additional feelings. I always love looking at the lighting when I'm at a theater production. So I'll be looking at the stage and then I look up and I try to see what lights are being cast on the stage because lights are used in theater to convey feeling. If you're looking at a scene that is supposed to convey sort of lighthearted happiness, you'll almost always see a yellow and a blue light shining at the stage. So color really does influence feelings. Of course, color goes far beyond the basic hue, which is where each color sits on that color wheel. Hue refers to the origin of the colors that we can see. So primary and secondary colors, yellow, orange, red, violet, blue, and green are hues, as are the tertiary colors, which are mixed colors where neither color is dominant. But each color also has a broad range of moods, which can be expressed through different levels of saturation and hue. Saturation defines the brilliance and intensity of a color. As saturation increases, the colors appear to be more pure, and when you lower the saturation of a color, it becomes progressively more gray. Value has to do with how light or dark a color is. You can add black to a color to shade it darker, or you can add white to a color to tint it lighter. And all of these adjustments have an effect on the emotional messaging of the color. Understanding color, and specifically how most people interpret color, is very important for anyone who plans to communicate a message using graphics, a message that they want the target to visually and mentally engage with, and once engaged, to understand the way you meant them to understand it. Graphic design can be a combination of words and graphics, or it can be all graphics, or it can be all words. Fonts can be used also as part of size and perspective in visual hierarchies. But fonts also matter on their own. Each font is a design element, and it can express ideas and feelings in addition to the words they spell out. That's why I love this graphic, because those words are all the same, but those two messages are entirely different. Fonts as a design element could be the subject of an entire presentation all by itself. Well, that's true of all of the elements that we're talking about, but I'll focus on just a couple of points about fonts for this presentation. There are a couple of different considerations I'd like you to be thinking about when you think about fonts. First, every brand must have a brand guide that dictates which fonts to use for the brand. Those fonts should be used in every situation except for when a different font is required to get a message across. For instance, if you'll recall that Bentley Megafactory ad we looked at earlier, the font in that ad isn't the font in Bentley's brand book. If you go to Bentley's website, their fonts are used throughout the website, they're brand fonts, but that ad did not use a brand font. So for larger format advertising, like a website or an annual report, your brand fonts really should be used. For ads, use fonts that best express the messaging of the ad. Now that could mean the brand fonts if you're sending a pure brand message, but it could also mean some more expressive fonts related to the point of the ad. Now here's where your challenge comes in. The fonts still need to be true to the brand. So you still need to look for fonts and font families that don't contradict your brand or somehow make people feel like the brand is something other than what you want them to feel like it is. But you can use different fonts. Finally, when it comes to fonts, less is always more. In graphic design, less is always more. A well-designed ad can certainly express the idea of chaos, but the ad itself should never be chaotic, and one too many fonts can take a perfectly coherent message and make it messy and chaotic and unintelligible. One of the biggest mistakes most non-graphic designers make is the mistake of filling up all the space. Space in an ad isn't an empty place that needs filling. Space is a graphic element, and it can be used to direct the eye, influence emotion, and emphasize your message. The most basic understanding of space in advertising is that you want to use the space around content elements to draw attention to particular elements. As you can see in this example from the Visme blog, where your eye focuses on the image in the left is a toss-up between the astronaut and the moon. It's not clear where the ad wants you to focus. The image on the right makes it pretty clear that the focus should be on the astronaut and the astronaut in space. They didn't make the moon smaller, they just created much more space above it, which drew the eye to the astronaut and the idea of space itself rather than the moon. And of course, size and perspective are also used in this example. So space can also be used as a message itself, which you'll see in this next slide. One of the most referenced examples of this graphic design technique of negative space or using space as the message is this FedEx logo, where the space between the E and the X is used to create an arrow. It's a very literal and sort of cheeky reference to FedEx moving packages. The graphic designer of this element must have also been particularly pleased with her or himself because the arrow also alludes to the graphic design principle of movement, which is typically achieved through thoughtful use of space. The use of negative space can also be quite elegant. It's another way of using space to create emphasis. In my experience, it takes a particularly refined awareness of the relationship between items and space to create a strong negative space image. As with everything in graphic design, less is more. You want to strip down your elements to only the most important pieces for conveying your message. When we're talking about movement, which is sort of where looking at space in graphic design takes us, we also have to talk about scanning patterns. Readers scan pages using predictable patterns. Not everyone follows the same patterns, and people who live in right to left reading cultures have markedly different patterns than those who live in left to right reading cultures. You don't need your design to appeal to all patterns. You just need to design to the most common page scanning patterns. And one of the two most common is shown on this slide. So most Westerners scan pages from left to right, starting at the top and working their way to the bottom. This graphic shows that the strongest points on a page are the upper left and lower right quadrants, because we're always working our way from the top to the bottom, going in a left to right pattern. The best supporting place in the page, so your primaries are top left and bottom right, then the best supporting place in the page tends to be that upper right quadrant, and the weakest area of the page is the lower left quadrant. Especially when your ad relies heavily on text, then using this F pattern is ideal. When using heavy image or graphical content, it's often common to use the Z page scanning pattern. You see, the brain processes images faster and slightly differently than it does text. So as you can see from this graphic, you still start in the primary optical area of the top left, and you end in the terminal area of the bottom right. But you can use more equal space of the weaker areas in the lower left and the top right when you're designing with images. F and Z aren't the only page scanning patterns. Other patterns include the golden triangle, zigzag, and something called 3F. And they're all worth looking into, but you'll probably find you rely on F and Z scanning movements most often in your design work. Another important consideration in your graphic design is where elements appear in relation to one another. In its most basic sense, proximity helps the viewer make sense of the relationships and their relative importance to one another. Either of the images in this graphic could be correct. If you were trying to make a point about female employees relative to male employees, you might use the image on the left. If you're trying to make a point about teams of employees, then you might use the image on the right. As with everything in graphic design, the intention of the message is what matters here, but you need to think about proximity in your ads to make sure that you are suggesting the relationships that you want the viewer to take from your message. Here's another excellent example of the use of proximity with a strong assist from the element of perspective, because obviously the world is much bigger than two windows on an upper and lower floor. So there's your perspective. This map sends a really powerful instant message about how close together two continents can be, in this case, when you use Federal Express. It's also yet another great example of the talent of the graphic designers that work on FedEx campaigns. Now, if you want to make your viewers uneasy or uncomfortable or squirmy, just fail the alignment test in your graphic design. Even though most people can't tell you why it makes them feel uneasy, things that are unaligned make people feel uneasy. Alignment provides order to your design. It relates to everything from how the elements are arranged in space to how your text is aligned. Now, there's no rule that suggests one type of alignment is better than the others. Text can be aligned to the left, center, or right, with or without what we call ragged edges on the unaligned side, or sides, because if you're aligning center, then both left and right are going to be ragged. And those are text alignment concepts. Graphical elements can also be aligned with left, right, or center orientations. What's important is that the elements not look completely scattered and random like that image on the left. If you go out and look at nature, you will find that its patterns are remarkably ordered. Our human eye seeks alignment to guide it, and our psyches seem to find some comfort in the order that comes from alignment. So now let's talk about the rule of odds. The rule of odds can be applied to a remarkable array of things, not just graphic design or photography. And the rule of odds suggests that using an odd number of options or elements can create more focus and stickiness than using an even number. You can apply the rule of odds to the number of elements in your graphic, or you can use it as a rule of thirds to separate your palette or the elements in your palette into equal sections of 3 or 5, for instance. The example in this image is about using odds in your composition of elements. This is one of the illustrations from Ed Verosky's truly excellent tutorial on still life photography, which will teach you a lot about graphic design, so I suggest looking it up. It's Ed Verosky, Verosky. Each one of these elements, even if it includes an even number of objects, uses the rule of odds to create balance and focus. The relationship between objects conveys a lot of information very fast. Beyond the objects' relationships to one another, the relationships also suggest mood, energy, and movement. Using the rule of odds helps make your message more coherent, no matter what you're trying to convey. This example is also representative of the rule of odds, only instead of dictating how many objects are used in the designs, it uses a 3-part grid to compose its message. The photograph itself is beautiful, but a similarly beautiful photograph, or even this photograph, cropped and positioned less thoughtfully, would have far less energy and movement. So it used the grids in a really thoughtful way to create that sense of movement. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the average person sees 5,000 ads per day, which means that anything we can do to increase retention is extremely important. Repetition can achieve that. It can increase both comprehension and retention. Repetition isn't just something to use on one page, though. It can be used in design to create cohesion among elements that are essentially different in shape or kind, things that would otherwise be really hard to see as grouped together. For that reason, repetition is one of the favorite graphic design elements of package designers. Shapes and objects and font treatments like chapter headings and subheadings also benefit from repetition to increase both focus and retention. And those types of repetition can be used all the way through a website or through a book or a series of literature elements that are part of a brand. Lines and grids show up both as actual design elements, but also as part of the pre-design thought process. Some of the best graphic designers I have ever worked with shared a similar trait of drawing dots or lines through their sketch pads before beginning to drop elements onto the page. Once they had conceptualized the message, they had an idea of how they wanted to direct the viewer from their first encounter with the ad to their full comprehension of the ad. And they used dots and lines and grids to get that initial thought on paper. Lines create movement, they organize the canvas, and they create energy. As you saw earlier in that fabulous beach image, and you can see again here in this illustration from Visme, lines can be literally present on the page, or they can be used suggestively through the use of a grid. In the first image, we can tell the man is running. It's a picture of a guy running. In the second image, we feel like the man is moving. the imaginary line of the design is moving him right off the page. Now, you'll hear designers debate frequently about whether to use a grid, whether or not to use a grid, disregard the grid. Here's what I'll tell you as most likely a not professional graphic designer. Grids will help you. I guess I'll use an analogy of music. When you're a musician and you're not a very experienced musician, you really need to follow the music. And following the music helps you make better music. When you're an extraordinarily experienced musician and you know all the rules of music and you've entertained them and turned them into muscle memory, then you can disregard the rules and play jazz. Not because you're playing music with no rules at all, but because you know the rules so well that you also know how to break them and still make music. So my recommendation is let skilled graphic designers argue about grid or no grid. For the non-skilled graphic designer, lines and grids are really useful. So up to this point, we've been discussing visual hierarchy exclusively. And again, I want to give a big nod to VisMe and their blog on visual hierarchy. And I want to encourage you to go read the blog and grab this infographic and print it out. You're going to have to paste a couple of pages together to do it because it's a very long, skinny infographic. And keep it where you can reference it whenever you're putting together graphics. And now let's talk about a few other considerations when it comes to graphic design. In his incredibly excellent book on graphic design for children, which I recommend that all adults should read as well, Chip Kidd gives the best example for understanding form. He suggests that you try to imagine yourself as a tiny baby without language. All you can perceive are forms, and you try to interpret them. So color, sizes, intensity, relativity, it's all there, but what do you make of it? Eventually, that child will put language with form, but in the beginning, everything is just form. And for the graphic designer, understanding that somebody may need to be able to interpret the ad entirely by form is very important. So, when you're doing graphic design, you need to try to back away from the implicit meanings of things and sort of experience the forms without the words. When I'm directing design teams, we always start by defining very clearly the message and the target and what we have to convey. And then the copywriter's job is to write out the whole message, and they may need to spend a page or two just really expressing the message and then tightening it up, getting rid of the superfluous words and get it down to its essence. Then we hand that copy over to the designers. And the designer's job is to try to remove as many words as possible and retain the full message that the copywriter conceived of. That's done through form. Now, it doesn't mean that every good ad is an ad without words. It just means form needs to convey as much of the message as possible when you're doing graphic design. So you're looking at how the elements on that page or on the screen or on a billboard make you feel. What do they mean to you? What is your impression of what the ad is trying to say? Form is really important and very powerful when used properly. Most of us have probably heard the phrase form follows function. I'm not sure everybody knows what it means though. Now this is another graphic from Chip Kidd's book, and it's the best example I've seen of how to understand the relationship between form and function. Function is determined by solving the design problem. So you ask the question, what is the content's purpose? What is this piece of content trying to do? The purpose is called function. And once you determine the function of that ad or that postcard or that Instagram post, whatever it is, once you determine its function, then its form or what it's going to look like should follow. As you've probably made note of by now, graphic design requires a lot of thinking. This next thing is hard for even the most skilled graphic designers to stay focused on, because it's easy when you start designing to get fixated on that image or that visual or that element. But underneath all of it and constantly in your awareness must be this question of who is this for? So we have to try to understand what the world looks like from that person that you're directing this ad to, from their perspective. So who are they? What is value to them? Because we're trying to create value for them to get them interested. We need to stay focused on the person we're encouraging to do something new or to try something different. So constantly asking who is it for is a very important part of graphic design. Graphic design is visual problem solving. So you need to get a message across, and you need to find the fastest, most impactful, most memorable way to do it. That's all about solving a problem. There's also a discipline called design thinking. And design thinking evolved out of many different design disciplines. It's a process for creative problem solving. On this slide, you see the main 5 questions of design thinking. I like to keep these questions in mind when I'm trying to solve a design problem, graphic or otherwise. And the questions are: what is, what if, what wows, what works, and then measure it, because just because we think we have a great idea doesn't mean we really have a great idea. So what is? Well, do we really understand the problem that needs to be solved? I can't tell you how often, and I'm not a graphic designer, by the way. I've done a lot of design direction in the process of directing a lot of marketing, but I am not a graphic designer. And just because somebody can use something like Illustrator or Photoshop doesn't mean they are either. As you're seeing through all of this, graphic design is a discipline that requires a lot of study. But when you're directing marketing, then you are often working with graphic designers, and the trick is to really develop this first question, what is, well enough that you can hand off that information to the designers and have them take it from there. If you don't do a good job of developing that deep understanding of the problem that needs to be solved, of the message that you need to get across, if you don't know what you want to have happen as a result of your ad, then the best designer in the world cannot give you an effective result back. They can give you something pretty, but they won't be able to give you something effective. This what is question is even more important when you're trying to do the graphic design yourself. So we start with what is. And then we sort of stretch way out from there and we say what if. So if anything were possible, what would we do to satisfy the customer's needs? Now, in an ad, we're talking about their needs for information or motivation to respond. We should have learned a lot about the answer to what if, or the universe of answers to what if, when we were exploring this idea of what is. And if you apply this set of questions across any other design discipline, like jewelry design, apparel design, house goods, or furniture, the same questions apply. You just apply them a little differently. So we're applying them to graphic design right now. So if anything were possible, what would we do in this visual to get them to respond to our message and act the way we want them to act, whether that's to come into our store or click on a button or send us an email address, whatever it is. The third question is what wows? So what ideas do we have to meet the needs of both the customer and the company? Because when we're doing graphic design, it's always about connecting a company with a customer. If you have only the customer in mind, then you can make graphic design decisions that don't properly reflect either the brand or the needs of the company. And if you have only the company in mind, then your ad's going to fall flat when you're speaking to the customer. The customer's not going to have any resonance with your message. So what wows? And the word plural is in there because you want to come up with a lot of ideas, as many ideas as you can at first. There's a tendency to come up with an idea, and our brains love what comes out of them. Our brains are just so self-impressed. So when we have an idea, we're like, ooh, shivers, that's a really good idea, right? It's important to have more than one idea, so you get the shivers over a lot of them, and then you get the clarity necessary to compare them to each other and throw out the ones that are not as good. So what wows? Then what works? So once you've figured out what your best idea or ideas are, then you develop the best solution from that idea, and you do some experimentation. I always ask designers to come back to me with multiple options. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the more options we work, the more clear we get about the message. And two, it gives them the freedom to come up with a couple of things that Like when you're directing design, or if you're working on your own and you get one idea stuck in your head, then you get very narrow focused about expressing your one idea or about reflecting back to the person who asked you for the design what they said to you quite literally. So working multiple ideas sort of breaks you out of those boxes and gets you to better expressions. And then finally, measure all advertising. And this is more once it's produced. So you commit to something, you put it out there, you think it's great. If it's your idea, you might really think it's great. You have to measure to see if it's actually giving you the result that you wanted. So these are the 5 questions of design thinking that are very important to use at the beginning and throughout every design process. And that's it. Those are the principles of design I wanted to talk with you about today. With these principles in mind, you can do a much better job of creating graphics to promote your business. Even if you aren't the person doing the design, even if you're working with a graphic designer, understanding these principles will help you give them better direction so they can do a better job giving you graphics that work. And it will also help you better understand what your designers create based on your direction. Also, remember, just because something looks pretty doesn't mean it's good design. Sometimes things that look very basic, even plain, can be excellent design. It's all about getting the viewer to do what you want them to do. I hope you enjoyed this information, and thanks so much for your time and attention. I hope you'll join me for future videos. Bye.